Hello out there, and welcome to C is for Columbia, Unlucky episode 13. We got a great show for you today. We're going to talk about some stories that you might have missed on the news or the other sources of media just did not cover. For our first story, I'm going to turn it over to Sam. So Sam, what can you give us?
Hey everyone, great to be back. So we're going to start off by talking about RFK's junior campaign. He was already a controversial presidential candidate, but he said something recently that has gotten him under a lot of fire, saying that COVID was ethnically targeted to spare both the Jews and the Chinese. Like I said, RFK Jr. already has a credibility problem, especially given past comments he's made regarding COVID and vaccines in general. One has to wonder if this is the main opponent to Biden. What are the chances of Biden not being the nominee? And what excuse do some progressives have for backing a conspiracy theorist such as RFK Jr.? Yeah, this is sad. I've seen way too many independent media outlets back RFK Jr., consider him kind of the standard bearer of the opposition to Biden right now. Look, we could talk about Biden all day. He's done some good things and some bad things. Nobody's really that enthusiastic for him. But this really shouldn't be the alternative. I mean, even Marianne Williamson, at the very least, has good beliefs and is a decent person, maybe even a better presidential candidate. But you really have to think, if this is the direction the Democratic primaries are going, it doesn't seem anybody else major has any interest in entering the race. Gavin Newsom's declined. I can't think of anyone else, maybe AOC, but she has no interest in running at this time. Sanders obviously is not going to run again. So I guess this opens up the discussion. Biden seems that at this point, assuming nothing tragic happens, that he's going to be the nominee going forward. Is there any credibility here for some sort of opposition to Joe Biden in terms of, running a meaningful candidate that has an appeal on a broader level? And, why are so many media organizations like Breaking Points, for example, backing RFK? Why are so many progressives putting all of their eggs in one basket with a guy that makes comments like this and already has a reputation of being a conspiracy theorist, especially in regards to vaccines? Ted, what's your take on this?
Well, right off the bat, I mean, if RFK is, as far as I know him, if RFK is the main opposition to Biden, I think he has name recognition, and I think that he has some existing recognition within the Democratic Party just because he's a Kennedy. But if he is their main opposition, I mean, Biden already basically had it in the bag, being that he's the incumbent. But if he's the main opposition, then yeah, Biden really has it in the bag. I don't see RFK playing any significant role electorally against Biden. I think that the language that he uses and some of the rhetoric that he uses in order to get media support and a lot of publicity surrounding him, he uses a lot of the same tactics that a Trump figure or even Vivek Ramaswamy, who's running in the Republican Party, has a lot of the same energy. Not so much regarding specifically the vaccine thing, but that energy of, again, there's frustration that was not resolved within the Democratic Party or within probably America more broadly speaking. There's a lot of pent-up anger towards whatever is seen as the powers that be, and that still exists within America today, and in a large amount, at least large enough that you can throw out extreme opinions on either side, Republican, Democrat. It really doesn't matter. You can throw out these what are seen as extreme positions and get a lot of media coverage and garner a lot of support, fringe claims that can be made and then reconstructed later on in order to fit cohesively together. Those are kind of attractive to I want to say it's a pretty small minority, to be honest. Like, they're pretty attractive because they oppose whatever exists, which this select demographic, the select constituent, is already upset about. And it doesn't really matter what's being said, what RFK says up front, because he can always backtrack and organize those thoughts into something more cohesive later on, once he's already got people that are already angry behind him. The numbers of those people are not, in my mind, significant, certainly not significant enough to make any headway in an incumbent primary, the Democratic primary. More or less, though, I think that the media outlets, though, the media organizations backing RFK are doing so because it does get attention, and they're trying to sell time on their networks, and that's about it. Like, why are we talking about him? Well, because he's fringy and out there and makes for a good conversation. But I don't honestly think he plays any significant role in the primary to come, especially because it's a incumbent president that he's running against. Yeah, that's about all my take. I mean, do you have any thoughts? I gather that you don't really like him very much.
No, not at all. I mean, I'd be willing to reconsider Marianne Williamson. Again, I don't think she has much of a chance.
What happened to her?
She has an appeal to the progressive left. She endorsed Bernie Sanders when she dropped out in 2020, rather than endorsing Joe Biden, or in Warren's case, just not endorsing anyone.
Yeah.
Which I still think was pretty funny, personally, but minor point.
Yeah.
Yeah, Marianne Williamson, I mean, I don't really have anything against her. She just seems kind of like a silly, hippie, crystal energy type of person, but she seems harmless.
We've talked about her in the past that she doesn't really have any constituents to talk about. She's simply putting money into a campaign to try to gain support for fringe issues.
In her case, I wouldn't say as much fringe as RFK Jr., but more so outside of the establishment of the Democratic Party, like to the
okay, progressive.
Of course, like to the left of the Democratic establishment. And we discussed on a previous podcast, the Democrats aren't going to have any debates.
Correct.
Which I don't think is that surprising, personally, as they have an incumbent president. But just we've discussed it before, that there's just not a lot of traction. I'm just kind of sick of listening to people shill for RFK Jr. He's not a good candidate. He wouldn't be a good president. And it's silly to me. I get the need for an alternative to Biden,
That's
but
interesting.
Sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know, is what I would basically say.
That's interesting. I mean, and other times it's the opposite. That people feel that way anyway. And some other people might feel that, well, I will go for the devil I don't know versus the one that I do know.
Well, speaking of the devil we do know, Donald Trump, as we know, is somehow running for election again. There's so much we could cover here, but I'm going to try to condense it in something that doesn't come off as a long-winded rant about Donald Trump that we've all heard before. I've got a couple of articles, one from The Guardian and one from The Hill, I wanted to bring up. So The Guardian ran an article stating that Biden's stability beats Trump's volatility. Is what they stated. And what it's basically gone on to is that Biden's not a popular president. We all know that. But at the same time, he doesn't seem to turn off and offend independent voters. And it seems that while the progressive base is dissatisfied with Biden, a good chunk of them are probably going to be willing to vote for Biden again, especially if the opposition is Donald Trump. And this is Biden's strength here, is no one would vote for him unless he was running against Donald Trump. But to his benefit, he's going to get a run against Donald Trump twice. So you can't really beat that in terms of his chances of actually being elected. I think somebody like Ron DeSantis, who I don't like, but would probably have a pretty good chance of beating him. We could turn this into a conversation about, the Republican primaries. And we actually have talked about DeSantis in the past on the show. And I think what we've both agreed on is that he could win in a general election, but his chances of beating Trump in a primary aren't especially high. The other article I wanted to bring up and kind of, synchronize these 2 points is there's an article from The Hill stating that Biden has raised over $72 million in his second quarter, which is double what Trump was able to run. And the reason why I liked this article is because we have to remember about the 2016 election. Trump actually ran a pretty cheap campaign, and I don't mean cheap in terms of his personality. I mean cheap in terms of infrastructure, in terms of a get out the vote type of effort that we generally see in presidential elections. And I guess what I find interesting about this is that the article from The Hill is kind of implying that Biden's chances of winning are higher because he's been able to double the fundraising compared to Trump. But at the same time, though, that might not necessarily matter as much as some liberals want it to matter. And it certainly didn't in the 2016 election. In the 2016 election, Clinton had a much more sophisticated campaign with infrastructure, a get out the vote effort, things of that nature. Trump had none of that, but he still managed to win. And, that's kind of where we are right now. Trump's still a bit of a wild card. It's definitely an expect the unexpected when Trump's in the race. I guess where I'm at in terms of my prediction right now of Trump's chances, and again, it's still pretty early, anything can change. Trump was able to beat Hillary because he did better than expected with independent voters. And I just feel like at this time, independent voters aren't really as inclined to vote for Donald Trump. What I've always said about Donald Trump is there's an episode of Family Guy, it's a very early episode, where Peter and Lois win a boat, and they go into the office to pick up the boat. And the salesperson says, listen, you can have a boat or the mystery box.
What, are you crazy? We'll take the boat.
No, not so fast, Lois. A boat's a boat, but the mystery box could be anything. It could even be a boat.
And that's how I felt about Donald Trump. He was the mystery box candidate. A lot of people were willing to roll the dice on Donald Trump. And we had 4 years of his presidency. We had the insurrection of the Capitol after he denied that Biden won the election. And from my perspective, I just don't really see enough independent voters willing to swing to the Republican side. I live in Arizona, where, by the way, it's freaking hot as heck right now. It's about 115 degrees. But Arizona historically had been a conservative state, but now we have a Democrat and an ex-Democrat current independent senator. We have a Democratic governor, and we actually did vote for Biden in 2020. And I think you're going to see kind of a trend here is that a lot of people, including independent voters, would be willing to vote for a Republican, and a lot of Republican candidates might have an advantage over Joe Biden as he's unpopular, doesn't really have an energized base. But the issue is he's not running against Ron DeSantis. He's not running against Nikki Haley. He's not running against Chris Christie. He's certainly not running against Mike Pence or John Bolton. So this is it's just Biden's presidency is going to be defined by Donald Trump, because what Biden basically was a placeholder president. We all came together and said, listen, nobody's that happy about this. We've got to get Trump out of office. Biden even, as I think I've mentioned on the show before, Biden suggested and hinted that maybe he would just serve for one term. Biden's going to get a run against Trump twice, and that gives him a very odd advantage that we haven't really seen in presidential elections in the past. I've been going on a bit, so I want to kind of turn it to you. But I mean, how important do you think the fundraising aspect of this is? Do you think Biden has more of a chance because people view him maybe not as a popular president, but as a stable president? What's Biden's chances of holding on to the executive branch, and is Trump's campaign essentially done?
Oh, well, okay. Well, let me rewind there. You asked first, what does his campaign's outraising of Trump's, or the Trump's current campaign, signify? And if I understand right, and let me just clarify, Biden has outraised Trump twice over for the 2024 campaign so far. Is that correct? Okay, so those early campaign contributions, of course, are going to be, I imagine they're going to be spent rather quickly. So my follow-up to that would be, what does that early those early financial numbers, do those actually signify anything? I mean, Clinton had outraised Trump for the 2016 campaign. And so it doesn't seem like it's that significant to me, particularly because the financial numbers are so early, the second quarter of 2023 for a 2024 election. That just doesn't seem as significant because a lot of that's going to be spent on primary stuff, although Biden can probably afford not to spend too much on his primary. One would hope, but for his sake. So I just don't think that early campaign contribution numbers like that are that significant to me. Of course, Trump got a lot of free publicity in 2016 and free press, as was shown after the election. And I don't think the press is as willing to give him as much free time anymore. I don't think that that's the model, because they're aware of that now. And they know that people are aware of it as well, that talking about him gives him more and more publicity. And leading up to the election, you might see that they try to minimize how much they talk about him. And that might be really hard because coming up to that election, he may be involved in a lot of criminal trials that are coming to a head because they may try to time those trials alongside the election in order for them to have the maximum political value, particularly that one in New York. Because that one in New York, was it the district attorney that brought that? He ran specifically saying, I will get Trump. I will get Trump. I'll get him for something. And he ran to get into that office specifically to bring a charge against him. So it's going to be very hard for the media not to talk about him. And with that being said, the money might not be as significant because the media is going to have to talk about him anyway. And for Trump, it doesn't really matter what's being said. As long as you're talking about him, I think he's content with that. And that helps him at the end of the day, which makes it very hard to campaign against him in a traditional way. You really have to campaign for yourself. Going off of that, of course, campaigning for yourself, you said that the article mentioned Trump's volatility beats Biden's stability. I think that's what you said verbatim. First of all, interesting that you mentioned we've had 4 years of the guy. We've had 4 years of Trump. And he still comes off in this particular phrasing as volatile. You would think that you could get a pulse on someone after 4 years of them being in office. It's kind of hard to avoid getting into patterns of normalcy and stability. Even if the stability is something people don't like, it comes off, though, as, well, this is the Trump way or this is the Biden way. And we are used to that, and we can kind of digest it. And if we still haven't digested Trump to the point where we still see him as volatile, I think that actually ends up playing in his favor, not just in his base, but these independents that he needs to pull. Basically, he needs to pull those independents in order to have any chance of winning. If he can bet on them wanting to see a more of a human figure in any capacity over Biden, he delegates most things outside of his direct control and acts more as a mouthpiece, which gives him a lot of stability. He can let the interests speak through him and act through him, through his administration. That gives him a lot of stability, and it often makes people a lot happier because it's not as much of a crap show. It's not as crazy and over the top. And you don't hear about him as much in the news, of course. You don't hear about Biden. For the 4 years we had Trump, it felt like every day was something new with the guy. So volatile, yeah. Interesting that his volatility, I think, could actually end up playing into his favor. Because I think those independents that want a person will look at Biden and say, well, I can't really see a person through his office, you know? As a voter, he's a very distant figure. Whereas Trump, although he is the president, he should be and he's a former president, in theory, he should be just as distant as anyone else. But if he acts volatilely and outside of a norm and unpredictably, that can, even if you don't like how he acts, it can come off as more human. He's acting on his own terms. And for some people, not saying for everyone, but particularly for independents, I think, they want to see that in some capacity. They may not like the person that they see through his actions, and that might deter them from voting for him, but that might also deter them from voting at all. And therefore, it's not necessarily putting that into Biden's favor. I actually think the fewer people that vote, the better Trump is off.
Absolutely.
And if a lot of people can be deterred from voting, then that helps him out. I think the same case was in 2016. I think both candidates were better off the fewer people voting, and Trump just happened to win that coin flip, because I don't think people liked Hillary very much. Biden is a lot more vanilla. He's hard to hate, but he's also hard to like. So it is a slightly different game. And then you mentioned, okay, we've had 4 years of the guy. That was also, it's going to be 4 years ago next November. Not this November, but next November. And the public memory is not very strong. So if these court cases have not come to a head by then, and are not coming to a head right around the election, then I don't think that most people will be going to the polls thinking about January 6th. I think they'll be thinking about what can either of these options, how do they benefit me? How do they benefit my community in general? How do these two parties benefit or are claiming to benefit my community in general? And that's going to come down to what's being talked about. As with like any national election, what can get talked about? And it's kind of there's some things that are traditional in that if immigration is on the table, and it's hard to say whether it will be, if immigration is being talked about, then it usually plays in the Republicans' favor. If healthcare is on the table, that usually plays in the Democrats' favor, which I think COVID was a huge boost to Democrats. And not trying to say that RFK, by the way, is accurate in his claims of the COVID virus was avoiding certain races. But I think how people might hear that is that the COVID virus and the reaction to COVID benefited a few more people than it did others. And those for whom COVID actually was a benefit, for those for whom COVID was a good thing, I think a lot of people look at in suspect. I think a lot of people looked at those people and say, why would an international pandemic benefit you? That should have hurt all of us. We all said we're all in this together, and yet you came out on top. So why is that?
Well, I have some final thoughts, just to kind of bring this all to one piece. You mentioned the difference kind of between the 2016 election and the 2020 election, with Clinton in 2016 and Biden in 2020. What's kind of amusing about it for me is, like, in terms of a policy standpoint, there's not major differences between Clinton and Biden, like, overall. But Clinton was just so hated, and there's so many ways you could go about this. She had been in the public eye a lot. In a literal sense, Biden was in the public eye in the past. He had ran for president, I think, in '88, and lost partly due to plagiarism issues, actually. But, like, a senator from Delaware, while they're in the literal sense in a public eye, generally speaking, the average American at that point of time was a lot more familiar with Hillary Clinton. than Joe Biden. Ultimately, like, I think we can assess that. And I just think ultimately, with Hillary Clinton, she just had such a bad reputation at this point, and there had been such a focus going all the way back to even the 90s to kind of create this negative image of her. And I'm not necessarily defending either candidate, but what I will say is this is it's kind of amusing to me that while Clinton and Biden aren't really that different from each other, a lot of independents had an easier time sucking it up and riding with Biden, let's say, than being ready for Hillary. We weren't ready for Hillary, but we could ride with Biden. We could always ride with Biden. And, that could be another can of worms. I mean, sexism maybe played some role in that. I guess what I would say in conclusion is it's very hard to predict an election, especially right now. You mentioned that you're not sure how fresh the January 6th riots, insurrection, I should say, will be in people's minds. And I wonder that as well. I wonder, to a lot of people, the insurrection was like the be all end all. Like, how could you be a Republican, or at the very least, how could you support Trump after that? What will be interesting to me to see is how much will the insurrection hurt Trump's public image when the election actually really starts to get underway. And I guess we'll just have to wait and see. And when it does happen, we'll be here to report it. Ted, do you have any final thoughts?
I do have one final thought, and it's a callback from, I think, 2 episodes ago. You mentioned Chris Christie, and you said that he is going to play a significant role. And I want to hold you to that. Do you still think Chris Christie will play a significant role? And not maybe get the nomination, but play a significant role?
Yes, and I'd like a chance to elaborate, because I think 2 episodes ago it was something I had kind of said at the very end of the episode. Here's my prediction. Does Chris Christie beat Donald Trump? No. Like, he probably doesn't, but is he going to be one of the main candidates in the long run? The internet is free to roast me for this if this prediction ends up being wildly inaccurate. I think Chris Christie's floor for the campaign, in terms of delegates, is third place. I think Chris Christie has the potential to come in third place in the Republican primary. Now, it doesn't really make a difference, but I think beyond Trump and DeSanctimonious, let's say, Christie is probably, out of all of the candidates like Mike Pence, Nikki Haley, those candidates, I think Christie is going to be the one that gets the most support. For the record, I'm certainly not endorsing him for president, and I highly doubt he even wins the Republican nomination, but I do think he is going to be a bit of a sleeper candidate, and he will end up winning some of these primaries. And I will say I will give Chris Christie this much respect. Out of all of the Republican candidates, he's the only one that seems to be willing to aggressively go after Trump. Is he a hypocrite? Yeah. But he's willing to go aggressively after Trump. And I think he has the right kind of personality to hold himself against Trump in a debate compared to, let's say, Nikki Haley, where it's really unclear to me what her campaign is actually about. Every interview I see with Nikki Haley, it's just very unclear what she's trying to communicate. So my prediction is Trump first place, DeSantis second place, Christie third. That's my prediction for the primary.
And Chris Christie's a hypocrite, huh?
I think in the sense that he backed Trump and was very supportive of Trump. I say, look, in my opinion, if you're going to be that supportive of him originally and then try to portray yourself as like the tough alternative that's going to go after Trump, it's like, okay, I mean, you didn't seem to have a problem with him being president back in 2016. You didn't have a problem with him running again in 2020. So yeah, he's a hypocrite. Everybody in both parties in some way is probably a hypocrite somehow.
And that is exactly what I was going to say, is that politics, it is a bit of a hypocritical game.
Politics is show business for ugly people.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
That includes me, by the way. I'm ugly people.
Well, and that's why we don't show our faces. That's why this is a entirely audible broadcast, of course. And we hope you guys out there enjoyed listening to us and not having to look at our ugly mugs. Keep on listening. We'll have more content for you coming your way. And we'll see you next time.